I think most people in this room know very well, Mark Rosenberg. Mark joins us from FIU. He was the former president of FIU, currently heads up an institution and an initiative for cyber policy at FIU. He has been through several roles there. I think he was provost, he was dean, he was, I believe, chancellor of the education system in Florida. So quite a luminary. And welcome as a community leader and welcome as a friend. Happy to have you here, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here at Miami-Dade. FIU has a great partnership with Dade, and a lot of our very, very best students are beneficiaries of Dade education. So thank you. It's good to be back, and Yuta, thank you for the invitation. So I'm interested in the interface between technology and institutions, technology and behavior, technology and public policy, and Yuta has asked me to spend some time on issues related to AI, artificial intelligence, and national security. I've worked on national security off and on and in national security for about 4 decades, and there's no doubt that AI presents some formidable challenges to those who daily wake up thinking about national security. And indeed, at FIU, one of our programs in the Jack Gordon Institute is a program that prepares our students for taking jobs with the intelligence community. When they graduate, they already have their security clearances as a consequence of coming through our program, which obviously we're very, very pleased about, because the main focus that we have is on student success. And this new domain, if you will, is one where we've got to be successful. We don't really have a choice. So what I want to talk about this morning very briefly is AI, national security. And I was intrigued by the notion of AI needs us or we need AI. And in many ways, we don't need AI in national security decision making. I can assure you of that. It fundamentally complicates the kinds of challenges that our decision makers have as it relates to national security. And I'm going to try to illustrate why in a moment. So I've got 4 basic themes. One is, let me see, I got to do this too. I'm not a great multitasker, but here we go. The first is that to understand the interface and to understand this topic, we should understand that change is changing. We have to be masters of understanding how change is changing. AI is clearly ushering in a new era for us, and I'm going to talk about that. Second of all, national security doctrine is going to have to change to a new order, a new disorder. National security doctrine essentially has been uniform with variation since the end of World War II. But now we're in a huge change mode. Not too sure where we're going. We've got to figure that out. But at the same time, the international context carries with it both old and new challenges to national security, which complicate the issue of how AI fits even more. And as a consequence, I just want to spend a moment or two on the skill sets that are needed. Let's see. Here we go. So what about change? Basically, change is moving from linear to exponential. And as an educator, I can assure you that I probably can do linear change just about as well as anybody, but I really get impatient with it these days, because in many ways, while we talk a lot about change in higher ed, we don't really practice it as well as we should. Ray Kurzweil put it, I think, best as he was surveying what was likely to happen in this century. He made the point that there will be more change in the first 2 decades of this century than there were in the entire last century. And indeed, I think we're definitely seeing that. He's followed in thinking that's influential for me by Salim Ismail, who talks about moving from linear change to exponential change. And in many ways, many of us are grappling now with how do we deal with exponential change? And that's one of the fundamental challenges, no doubt, we have in higher education. I go back on this to what one of the early change agents of the 20th century said now was Vladimir Lenin, in terms of he was thinking through, this process of change, particularly in Russia. And he made the point that, and I'm going to paraphrase it, he made the point that it takes some decades, it takes a whole year to pass. In some decades, it takes a whole year to pass. In other years, a whole decade passes. And clearly, if you think about COVID and all the challenges of that, if you will, tragedy, all the pain that was caused, one thing is for sure, change happened very quickly. I know in the case of our institution, I had a conversation with my chief information officer, Bobby Grillo, about 6 months into COVID. And I said, Bobby, how's it going? He says, Mark, you won't believe this, but we've gotten more done in the last 6 months than I've gotten done in the last 5 years. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, we've gone to telehealth, we've gone to teleadvising, we've gone to telecounseling. All of this has happened basically overnight in response to COVID. And in many ways, it's because of that and how we responded that I actually am optimistic about how higher ed is going to deal with the challenge presented by AI. And then obviously, the world's going through paradigmatic changes. I don't have to spend a lot of time on that. You're part of that process. But what I want to do is go back a little bit, just very quickly, to traditional approaches to United States national security. And here I've put kind of the leading proponents, if you will, of the doctrine as it's emerged, national security doctrine. But what I want to point out is that in each of these approaches, whether it's deterrence or containment or rollback or soft power, it's based on the notion that it is the nation state that is central to national security. National security pivots around state-centric approaches and paradigms, whether it's regular warfare or, if you will, border security. Well, obviously, as we know, all of that is changing. Indeed, the Russia-Ukraine war has sent some very, very strong messages and hard-earned lessons about that change. But we see at the same time an interesting phenomenon, in part illustrated by Russia-Ukraine, and that is we see a surge in primordial tensions globally. When I talk about primordial tensions, I'm talking about rooted antipathies and passions coming out of countries related to neighboring countries, related to regions. So it's kind of paradoxical. 21st century, maybe beyond the nation state? No, hardly. We're seeing a return, if you will, to an earlier era, even while the threat scenario is far more complicated and diverse. And in that, clearly, we go from regular warfare to irregular warfare. Now, periodically, we've had that challenge, as you know, for those of you who went through the Vietnam era. But clearly, in this context of conventional to irregular, the tools are a little bit different. We have hackers, we have intelligence operatives who are specialists at massive amounts of information, disinformation, and misinformation. We indeed have a far more complicated scenario of conflict that we have to manage through. And at the same time, these old forces, these old primordial forces are re-emerging, layered on top of the new forces. When I got involved in our program at FIU on cybersecurity policy, what I began to realize was that indeed what once was a positive tool of communication, namely the internet and the World Wide Web, has become a tool that has massively increased our vulnerability. Not only vulnerability at the national level or at the state level or at the local level, but at the family and at the individual level. You wake up in the morning and one wrong keystroke, and you have lost your access to your patrimony, and you may never get it back. And so it scales up from a security viewpoint, now from the individual to, if you will, the broader unit. And in that raises a big question for us that those of us who are political scientists and those of us who study policy are very, very concerned about, and that is, can there be a regulatory framework that at once is benign in allowing for individual freedom and liberty, but on the other hand, that enables us to protect ourselves? And one of the big questions that goes to is the issue of, if you will, privacy versus security, which if you look at, if you go to Israel, for instance, and talk with individuals there, they'll tell you, who are involved in cyber issues, they'll tell you that their major concern is security versus privacy. Clearly, we have that major challenge here in this country. Let's see, I went back too far. So, what is it about AI that is so salient, if you will, to the issue of national security? First of all, AI blurs boundaries. What does this mean for national security? Warfare becomes automated. Warfare becomes automated. And then the question is, who really calls the shots? Who identifies the targets? Who identifies the adversary? How much? How little? When? How does that happen in a context where AI becomes dominant in terms of information gathering and perhaps decision making? Second of all, national security in this context is not just an external issue. Now it becomes an internal issue. And that's why the issue of privacy versus security has come on, if you so hard. Cyber security issues are large and small. The person sitting next to you right here in this room could be someone who's going after FPL to shut it down forever, right now, sitting next to you. Or could be getting into your account. So this issue of vulnerability, if you will, becomes ubiquitous. And that's a challenge within the context, even more so, of AI. The technology race becomes paramount. And I'm going to predict right here, Yuta, that you're going to see over the next few years massive federal funding of initiatives that focus on AI related to our security. It's starting to happen now. It's going to become far more consequential, probably in the context of a new National Defense Education Act. You may recall that we had one in 56, 57 on the heels of Sputnik. Some of you were there, I was. I think we're going to see something like that in the next few, if you will, years. And then finally, what does this mean for you, particularly those of you in the private sector? There's no doubt in my mind there's going to be a lot more government intervention in your business. There's just no doubt. It has to happen. It will happen. And it's already happening if you look at the whole debate related to Elon Musk and his ability to determine, if you will, the national security of the United States directly and indirectly through his control over satellite communications in Ukraine. And you can now see a sense of urgency starting to emanate that is far different than we've had in the past. And that sense of urgency, my instinct, is going to lead to much more, if you will, federal intrusion. So what's going to happen here? Well, first of all, national security doctrine is going to need massive modification. It's just going to need massive modification. Second of all, our government is going to reorganize itself for a new technology race, and is going to have to prepare for new forms of conflict, because our national security structure is massively poorly positioned for what's coming at us now. Thirdly, new regulatory frameworks are going to be developed. And, you know, there are debates going on now. We even had one in our advisory board a couple of months ago that basically was characterized by the larger companies having one view and the medium and the smaller company types having quite another view about how this regulatory framework should evolve. And then, of course, as I said, more intrusion. So what competencies does that leave us with? I identified 8, but I just want to talk really about 5 of them. First, on flexibility. I think we're going to have to become a lot more flexible in terms of how we make decisions, in terms of how we get information, in terms of who we listen to. And the way I look at it is that increasingly we need to gear ourselves to expect the unexpected. Anybody who is surprised today by the unexpected probably needs to think through the range of scenarios that could be upon us in any circumstance. And in that context, ambiguity, in my mind, is the norm. And for people who move to South Florida, if I have a chance to meet with them before they get here, I say, listen, you got to understand something. If you're somebody who needs routine, do not come to South Florida. The best you can do is a rhythm. And it's a rhythm of disruption, a rhythm of uncertainty, a rhythm of ambiguity. And you need to be good in ambiguity. If you're good in ambiguity, you're going to love it down here. And in many ways, that's where overall this whole arena is going. So that's 1. 2, emotional intelligence. In all of the work that I've been privileged to be engaged in working with academic departments and boards of trustees and other universities, department chairs, leaders of all kinds, students, the one point that I continue to come back to is the importance of emotional intelligence. And that, for me, that issue of emotional intelligence now more than ever means find a way to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes before you make a judgment, before you make a decision. And if you can do that, I think we're going to be a lot better off as in our civil society. Right now, emotional intelligence is at times in short supply. And one of the things that you learn if you work in the policy arena, particularly if you're trained as an academic, which I am, the training really doesn't serve us very well, in part because we're trained to recognize that, to believe that that reason drives emotion. That reason drives emotion. When in fact, if you look at the policy world, even with all the data, even with all the analysis, even with all the thoughtfulness that's there, it's emotion that drives reason. And the sooner we can figure that part of it out, the more effective we are going to be in terms of restructuring what we need to restructure to preserve information security and reduce citizen and community vulnerability. The third issue, strategic thinking. For me, the issue of strategic thinking boils down to clarity. It's very difficult to get clarity these days about things that the ecosystem that you're working in, the boundaries of that ecosystem, the nature of humanity and how decisions get made. But if there's a way to get clarity, that will help you to drive intentionality. In terms of clarity will drive intentionality, what you can and should do. And I think there's no bigger issue. I mean, think of the conversation we've just had on ChatGPT. And it's kind of a dynamic of, hey, here's our clarity. This will help your intentionality. But remember that there are limits to the clarity we can have that ChatGPT gives us. So clarity drives intentionality. We need to work harder on that. On the digital capacity, I think most of you would agree that we're just at the beginning of where capacity challenges and opportunities are going between the Internet of Things and between quantum computing and CRISPR. We are just at the front edge of that paradigm change, and we've got to do a lot better to understand what that's about. In our case at the university, one of the things that we've done to help us is we've been very aggressive in setting up metrics of measurement. and down to the unit level. And so a lot of the opportunities that we've had to move up in the rankings have been driven by our focus on our willingness to set metrics, to identify numbers, and to hold every unit to those. That's helped us a lot. And my instinct is, as we go through more digitalization, there's going to be more measurement. Units will be measured globally, whether you like it or not, you're going to be measured. It's going to be transparent. It's going to be out there. We've got to get our organizations ready for that. And then finally, in terms of strength and resilience, I come back to the issue of optimism. It's important to have optimism about the present and the future. The research that I've done, I've been very interested in negative frames and framing in general. And what I've seen is that negative frames tend to galvanize thinking in directions that make it harder to have the flexibility that you need with the challenges ahead of us. So, in summary, what my message is, change is changing. Do we really understand that? National security doctrine is going to change necessarily. The international context is going to become more ambiguous and contradictory, and new skill sets are required. And I'm happy to answer any questions or further confuse you if that's your choice.
Thank you so much for the insight and enforcement. So, question please.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question regarding when talking about the competency needed for leadership. So we mentioned the strategic thinking part, and there are several metrics that you mentioned need to be set up. So from your point of view, what will be a good way for people normally like set up those metrics? Is it through like a panel discussion, or is like inquiries from like the mass, or what will be like a good recommendation for that part? Thank you.
I think it's a good question. How do you set up metrics? How do you think that through? My instinct is you start at the broader context level. What is the context in which you're trying to understand those metrics? Who are the leaders? What are the best practices? How do they measure, and how is that measurement relevant to your context? That's one. Two is that there needs to be a discussion with a group of like-minded people. By the way, every unit has change agents in it. All right, you want to know who the change agents are and what they're up to and what they're thinking. Every unit is going to have leaders. Every unit is going to have, for lack of a better word, laggards. They're not going to be change agents. They might be willing to go along, but they're just not thinking about change in the same way that you need to. So identifying those leaders and forming a coalition with them and trying to get them to identify relevant, viable metrics, I think is important. And the reason I say be positive is that I try not to listen too long and too hard to negative people. And they're around us. We know it. I mean, that goes with the turf. And academics are trained skeptics by definition. Some have already become cynics, but by definition, skeptics. And so, but find those who have a broader vision for the future and want to and have the courage to get there. And then finally, if you're going to fail fast. There's no fault in failure. The fault is in not figuring out what you could have done better and getting on with that. So I've come around a lot to the issue of metrics in part because at least in a public setting, and many of you represent corporations that are public, accountability increasingly is going to those metrics, those measurements that are going to be global. They're out there. They're going to be, if they're not out there now, they will be out there. And that people will make choices about who they collaborate with, who they cooperate with based upon the reliability of those metrics.
So for me, my education background, so I got my PhD in physical chemistry, and I totally understand that there are people who are super critical. And a lot of times when you propose something, and the most feasible or most common response is that it's going to work. And they always gonna say that.
Yeah.
So, for your perspective, what kind of advice would you give to folks that, they try to always approach stuff from a really critical, even cynical place? I feel like it's really hard to convince people,
Right.
Especially when, their mindset still.
Okay, so when as you just said, I've been through practically everything in a university context. When I became a dean, one of the older deans came up to me and said, "Mark, you're going to become a dean. Do you know what you're getting into?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure, but tell me, what do I need to know?" He said, "Mark, on any given issue, 30% of the faculty will tell you privately what to do. Another 30% will be opposed to what you want to do, not because it's a good or a bad idea, just because they can oppose you. And the remaining 40% genuinely won't know what to do on that issue. But you can rest assured of one thing, on any public discussion of that issue, the 30% who privately told you what to do will not say so publicly." So what that told me was that, you've got to have courage if you're going to be in a leadership position. And I think the best you can do in that is to be fair and consistent. But Lincoln said, if you get to a rock in the field, plow around it. And lots of times, the situations that I've seen are situations of asking a colleague, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? A lot of colleagues would just want to be right. They don't care about being effective. Right? I don't care whether it's public sector or private sector, profit making or nonprofit, they just want to be right. But I think in leadership positions, that's why the clarity and intentionality is so important. My instinct is you want to be effective. That doesn't mean you're going to be immoral and unethical. What it means is you've thought through, it may not be the shortest distance between 2 points. It may be a zigzag because you've studied your ecosystem and you understand where the rocks are in the field.
We have another question right here.
Yes.
All right, Mark, thank you for your presentation. It's very good.
Well,
But many of the speakers that I've heard on this topic have indicated that large corporations and technology are the new power brokers.
Yeah.
Versus emerging economies, China, et cetera, that they will play the largest role in the new world order.
Right.
I do agree that, well, not that it matters, but I do agree that legislation is required. What is the remedy for the political obstinance and sort of clownery that limits legislation to manage technology companies?
okay, so what is
let me be more specific.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks would say that legislation is necessary. However, the focus can't be placed or the resources aren't there to make that legislation happen. How do we solve that problem?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I don't necessarily have an answer for that. And clearly, there needs to be a guiding consensus that evolves. And right now, I don't think we even have close to a guiding consensus. And really, what this gets at is there's a whole thesis, and you can look at it in I think the most recent articulation of it is in Foreign Affairs magazine, which was an excellent piece called The Power Paradox, which deals with AI and talks about how difficult it will be that AI is essentially largely being driven and owned by the larger companies in the world, and that the US government and other governments are going to have to share power in terms of determining what happens with AI. My instinct is that you're going to see some, how shall we say, hardcore veering in terms of legislation coming out of the U.S. Congress that will temper the worst instincts of corporate autonomy and go-it-aloneness. And I think that there will be a middle road that will be found, but I don't know when and where. I'm not too sure if that answers the question, but yeah, I think it's going to be a process. It's not going to be an event. Thank you.
Thank you.